Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here today. So, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are joining us. And I would like to welcome everyone. I'm Valentina Martinez. I am the Association Manager at the IECA. And well, we are so happy to see the interest of this meetup that we have today. And I think it's because it reflects that there's a need and also a commitment of professionals and practitioners to engage in productive discussions on environmental communication. So while everyone's still connecting, we're going to give a few minutes. I would just like to start presenting our organization and also to explain how we are going to run the session today. I know there are current members that are joining us today, and we would like to thank them because for their ongoing support to the association. But we are also happy to see new faces because these events are open to members and non-members. So I would like to introduce briefly our organization. So IECA was established in 2011 and is the Association for Environmental Communication Professionals and Practitioners that are engaged either in teaching, in research and in scholarship, in media and creative arts, in policy debates, or in even advocacy across the globe. So our mission is centered on advancing environmental sustainability through understanding and practice. So there are many ways that you can join the organization. Of course, it would be we would have the honor to have such a diverse persons and practitioners joining the association. So we have the memberships that we offer. And being a member of the ICA has some benefits like accessing a global network of professionals and practitioners. You will also have discounted rates for the training and events that the organization will organize. And also this year we started to have as part of the membership um, uh, an online access to our journal, Environmental Communication. But there's many other ways. If you are not ready for this type of commitment, there are many ways that you can be part of the IECA. One of them is that we're having also a big event that it's coming up that we just called the Virtual Expo, and it's a networking for environmental communication. And we're inviting proposals, submissions from individuals, groups, or organizations interested in either hosting sessions, facilitating roundtables, presenting research, conducting interviews. And our idea here is that we will have 24 hours, like a marathon, where we will come and share expertise, training sessions, strategies, what has been working, and even do some maybe regional discussions of environmental communication issues. So I'm going to leave in the chat all the links where you can explore the membership types, where you can explore the call of papers for the EC Expo, and also where you can follow us also through our social media, where we are always happy to share what you are doing, amplify your research, and really try to build this networking that I think is very important for our communications. So that was the part of of presentation. So before I forget, just let me put all the information here in the chat. And there it is. So I've included all the links where you can explore more of what I've talked about. So I think we have more people coming in. So welcome who has joined recently. And we are going to have a very interesting session today with Emma Frances Bloomfield and how it's going to work today. So we will be, first of all, we will be recording the session today. Because we wanted to have it available for people who could not attend today because of the timing. Number two that we kindly ask you is to mute your microphones, please. And we will start with Emma presenting briefly the basics of the book. Then we will have an interview. And then we are aiming to have around 20 minutes of a public section for questions and answers, because we are also interested that we have an opportunity to have Emma here and that everyone can engage on asking questions, because I'm pretty sure we're going to have a lot of them. So let me introduce Emma formally, our guest today, please. So Emma Frances Bloomfield, she's an associate professor of communication studies at the University of Nevada in Las Vegas. And her expertise includes science communication, environmental communication, scientific controversies, climate change, sustainability, and the intersection of science and religion. Emma Frances Bloomfield, she studied science communication, public interactions, and engagement with science. She has a vast published articles and a lot of publications. And today she will be sharing with us her latest book of how the integral role of storytelling in science communication is possible, what are the challenges, and what can we do? So Emma, I turn the screen to you now so we can start the session now formally.
Thank you so much, Valentina, and thank you to the IECA for having me. I just want to say this is going to be a few brief remarks, as Valentina said, so we can get right to the questions. I'll also note that my house is currently overrun with small mammals, so one of my cats might make an appearance, and you might hear my newborn son in the background. So just wanted to give you a heads up ahead of time. So. As we said, the conversation will be a little bit brief to start, and then we'll get into a deeper discussion. But for an overview, I just want to briefly talk about my theoretical background in regards to stories and storytelling. And then I want to talk about my concept of the narrative webs that I propose in my book, Science versus Story. And then I want to give just a few examples from the climate change case study, which is, of course, the case study most relevant to the IECA audience. So. To begin, I am an environmental rhetorician, so I draw heavily on rhetorical theory in defining narrative. Walter Fisher defines narrative as symbolic actions, words, and deeds that have sequence and meaning for those who live, create, and interpret them. So this is my approach to narrative. It's quite all-encompassing, which is how Walter Fisher wanted to define it, as something that is a paradigm for how humans communicate. But the fact that this definition is quite all-encompassing can lead to some tension for scholars on whether to consider science or science communication a story, and if so, how to appropriately marry the two. So the tension of story and non-story is the binary I set up in the title of the book, that we could think about science and story as being oppositional to one another. Some scholars believe that stories distort or add bias to science and the communication of it, so they prefer a more plain, using air quotes here, neutral or objective style of communication, to not have any unnecessary flourishes or extra information that might muddy the objective retelling of facts. But based on my working with rhetorical theory and specifically Fisher's broad definitions of narrative, I do consider science and science communication to be a story. And I lay out the reasons for that in the introduction of the book. So instead of this binary of story, non-story, I'm thinking about the ways that we might lean into and invite a consideration of science as a narrative form. So in this way, I invite us to consider scientific controversies, not just as matters of disagreement about facts and what to do about them, but of competing stories and storytellers, where we have stories that science or institutionalized scientific organizations are telling. And then we have, in our age of alternative facts, myths, and disinformation, alternative stories that people are weighing in this ecosystem of narratives. So when we're talking about scientific controversies, we're oftentimes up against rival stories. whether it's personal relationships, politics, economics, religion, social and news media. Science is not standing alone in its discussion of these many important topics. So I think it's important to consider the different stories that folks are weighing as they're making decisions, deciding which to adopt, and how the spread of information is influencing those decisions. I'm interested in all different facets of science communication, but my primary area is the environment. So I'm thinking, and I'll be talking about more in the talk today, about how climate change in particular faces these different types of narrative obstacles. So instead of that story, non-story binary, I conceptualize definitions of narratives more on a scale of narrativity to think about how the communication that we use is more or less story-like. So an example from my book is, if you think about the buckets, you might think of a story as being something like a fairy tale, and maybe a non-story is a recipe. But if we think about instead a scale of narrativity, we might instead rephrase it that a fairy tale is more story-like than a recipe. But then we might talk about a recipe blog, or someone's talking about a recipe that they've made, or an experience or an event they had to cook the recipe for. That's probably less story-like than a fairy tale, but certainly has more story elements than just a plain recipe. So I'm thinking about sort of scales of narrativity and considering communication to be fundamentally narrative in nature. And while I was working with this scale of narrativity, it was interesting to think about the various definitions of story and how many different elements that stories are said to have. So I was thinking that stories can vary on a variety of features in how more or less story-like they are. So it's not quite accurate to just use a single scale. So in combining scales and trying to create a visual heuristic, I came up with this shape, which I call a narrative web in the book. Of course, primarily because of the shape here, but there's also a lot of research on webs and storytelling, thinking about how stories are tangled webs, or thinking about indigenous storytelling as being wrapped up with characters of spiders. So I thought it was just a very appropriate shape to be thinking about 6 elements and their scales of narrativity combined together. So the 6 elements that I whittled down the definition of narrative to are character, action, sequence, scope, storyteller, and content. So each of these has a segment of the web dedicated to it, which I call a narrative wedge on the narrative web. So you can think about each of these as its own mini scale of narrativity. The 3 circles are important to the web as well. I define them from the center to the outside as micro, meso, and macro rings. And you can then plot these different features, narrative features, onto these different rings, from the most specific at the micro level to the more broad and abstract at the macro level. So just as an example, this is what a shape might look like when mapped on the narrative web when you are evaluating a story. Here we have the storyteller mapped on the micro ring, which means the storyteller is nice and specific, perhaps a known and trusted storyteller. We have action, sequence, and content mapped on the meso ring, so sort of a middling specificity or relevance. And then in this shape, scope and character are mapped on the macro ring, which is the most broad and abstract, lacking specificity. So through theory, I developed this a tool of the narrative web, and then applied it to 4 case studies: climate change, evolution, vaccination, and COVID-19. Climate change is the primary case study that I talk about in the book, but I use those other controversies to support a type of general patterns that I was finding in the communication. These controversies are, of course, all unique. They're different. They have different features that I talk about in the book. But I was also trying to find some kinds of overlap to think about generally, how can we think about stories in relationship to science communication? And so despite that variation, I came up with some general conclusions in the book that science's stories tend to emphasize the macro ring. Science's stories think about big picture scopes across space and time. They think about characters in terms of collectives, or there might not be human characters or characters at all in the story. The storytellers might not be specific. It might be an organization, or the storyteller might be unclear because we're hiding the storyteller and the scientist, right, in the story we're telling. So stories that science tells tend to emphasize those macro ring elements, whereas the rival stories from ideologies such as politics, economics, and religion tend to emphasize that micro ring. They tend to be very specific. They have examples. They talk about specific narratives, things affecting certain people. They talk about what's happening in your backyard. They really tend to have more micro level features. And I, of course, want to emphasize that there's no one ideal story shape here, but that we might learn from these rival stories to think about incorporating more micro features into science's narratives. But oversubscribing macro or micro rings has limitations. The macro stories of science, which I think makes them less story-like than other forms of communication, oftentimes lack something concrete for audiences to hold on to because they are so broad and abstract. But alternatively, if we only tell micro stories, those stories can be inaccurate because, of course, science is not just about specific examples, but is about these generalizations. Micro stories might also hide the broad impacts or the slow violence of certain topics and might reinforce harmful ideologies like neoliberalism that overemphasize the power of individuals. So in sort of splitting the difference between wanting to learn from rival stories, but also acknowledging that we can't just tell one type of story, I propose that we should map at least 2 wedges on the micro ring, which I also refer to in the book as a hub spiral, because on a spider's web, the place where the spider sits, which is less sticky as it waits for flies to come in, is called the hub spiral. So we want to have points of the story anchored in a place that then we can add variety to across the rest of the shape. And again, this is supposed to be a visual mapping tool, not to say that there's one correct way to map a story or there's one right answer in what a story is, but just a way to think about these different narrative features in relationship to each other. So I just have a few minutes left before we get to the Q&A, but I just wanted to briefly give an example of climate change and the character wedge, just to give you a sense of what this might look like. So in climate change's stories, we tend to have macro ring characters who are abstract and may fail to resonate with audiences' self-perceptions. So if in thinking about the characters, the audience's role, and the requirements of the story, I found a lot of references in the data that I analyzed using absent or collective characters. So for example, this first quote from the Nature Conservancy is describing climate change simply happening, right, with no people or no characters performing any actions. We also get the personification of non-human collectives such as research, multiple lines of evidence, or science, for example, from this NASA website. We also don't really have a place for audiences to get involved in the story when we lack characters, or we make human characters blameworthy or villains within climate change's narrative. These are, of course, true statements. For example, the EPA is talking about how climate change is happening because of human actions, such as the fossil fuels we use to generate electricity, heat and cool buildings, and power vehicles. An accurate statement, but also statements that put blame on people and makes us the villain of these narratives, which might resonate less with our self-perceptions. And of course, because we are potentially the villains and blameworthy in the story, we are required to make sacrifices for the greater good. In this intergovernmental panel on climate change quote, they talk about this is from their most recent report, that they say effective mitigation will not be achieved if individual agents advance their own interests independently. So we're being told in this story to sacrifice our comfort, our own individual needs and priorities for the greater good. Again, an accurate statement. These are changes that are going to need to be made if we're going to be addressing climate change. But in the story that's being told, it's undermining the agency of characters and might misalign with people's self-perceptions. So my larger conclusion here of just this kind of the character wedge of climate change is we might then experiment with mapping characters on the hub spiral or on their micro ring by adding in individuals, positioning audiences as heroes of the narrative, and inviting audience members to be a part of the story as more active agents. I'll just briefly summarize again, there's no ideal constellation shape here. It's really just a tool for experimentation. And all of science's stories are going to be audience, context, and purpose dependent. But I'm hoping that people might use this tool critically to evaluate stories, but then also as a building tool to think about the content and the information you want to share and how you might experiment with where the different wedges are mapped. And I know that was a really quick kind of example from the narrative webs. I know we're going to get into more detail in the conversation, but I want to just close with a quote I really like from James Kelso, where he wrote, "Science reflects not the meaning of the universe, but humanity's efforts to make their universe meaningful." So thinking about the ways that we subscribe, even the most plainest, most objective of facts, really with meaning. That's the purpose of the communication. So that's why I think story has a really important role to play in science communication. So thank you so much for that, allowing me to do that brief overview. And now I'm open to the Q&A and the rest of the interview. Thanks again, everyone, for being here. I think you're muted, Valentina.
Sorry. Thank you, Emma. I'm going to start with some questions, and then we're going to do a hybrid for the rest of the participants. We're going to take, you can unmute yourself and ask the question, and we will also take questions that are in the chat. So if you have questions, you can also write them there, and we're going to be coming back and forth. So we have as much as possible of the questions answered. But Emma, one of the first things that I would like to ask you is that we're talking about stories. And I want to know your story and what was your aha moment that you decided that this was an important subject for science communication, to work with controversies and seeing these narratives, the potentials of narratives to help science convey their story professionally. So what made you focus on this, and what inspired this book?
Absolutely. Well, I am not sure if he's here. He told me he was going to be here, but I didn't check the participant list. But my advisor at the University of Southern California, Randy Lake, really helped me to hone my attention towards science. It was a pretty simple statement, but he said to me, you know, all the things you're interested in, those are going to have a link between them. The variety of things I entered grad school interested in studying, he told me, well, think about what connects all those things, because they're probably more connected than you think they are. And it really, to me, came down to issues of identity. I was interested in how people became to identify as religious, as political, that joined groups, how those identities competed with one another. My husband was religious when we first started dating, and was also a scientist. So I got really interested in that negotiation of identity when there's conflict. So yeah, so I think influence from my husband and from Randy really got me interested in identities and how identities form. And being at USC, at my alma mater, I got the chance to meet Walter Fisher, who developed his narrative paradigm there. And storytelling and Kenneth Burke's dramatism and other theories of narrative really became an important part of my rhetorical training. So these have been things I've been thinking about. It's strange to say, but over a decade now, and they really came together in this book. So I'm very excited to be sharing that with everybody.
That's so nice to hear. And now that, because I also see some question here in the chat, what would be, because you say that what you're proposing, it's not how to, like a recipe to write perfect stories, but rather like to evaluate them and see what's going on. So what could you share some strategies science communicators can adopt from this to incorporate their storytelling into their work?
Yeah, absolutely. So, for example, in the wedge I shared just briefly in the chat was about characters, and oftentimes science's stories don't really have characters. It's about collections of events, aggregate events, or about processes. So, one thing we can do is potentially try to insert or add characters, particularly human characters who are like our audience, into our stories. Sometimes that won't be appropriate. But I think it's a potential tool that folks could turn to think about how can I make this story more relatable. Kenneth Burke talks about giving audiences a mind to follow. So even if the story is just framed by a scientist doing particular research, instead of just talking about the research and the methodologies of the research itself, can just be a way to add a more concrete, component to the story. But in the book, I talk about all 6 of the wedges and how folks might experiment with or try out micro ring features, but also just think about in general the ways that the information we're sharing about science is inherently narrative, and we can kind of lean in and emphasize some of those features that are already present.
That's good. Okay, let me, Joanne, if you unmute yourself and ask a question, I think it would be great.
Hi, Joe.
Hi, Emma. Thank you so much. This is so great. I have a future kind of question. I think this is very useful whenever you are a practitioner of science communication and also a scientist doing science communication, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering how to make this easily accessible, and if you have thought about ways for easy access to this information. And just one thing that I was thinking about was like, could this be gamified, right? Could we make the narrative web a game that you're like trying to roll the dice on? Okay, now we're gonna play the story with the character in the micro in the micro scale within the wedge, right? I don't know, but this was just my idea. But I was wondering if you thought about like making it accessible in different ways and how.
Yes, absolutely, Joe. I am working currently with my husband, Paul, who is a computer science professor here at UNLV, to create an online version of the web software so that folks can put in their own micro, meso, and macro ratings for each of the webs and then download it, and also download blank webs, because I'd love for this to be used in classrooms or for folks who just, it's fairly easy to draw, but if folks wanted to obviously download a more formal version to be able to use, I do want to make it accessible in that way. Gamifying it sounds really great. I think people could do that even on their own. Like think about the topic that you want to talk about and then just do a whole micro ring, do a whole macro ring, experiment with the different wedges and see where it goes. I think that would be really fun. I'm thinking about, John Cook's work with Cranky Uncle and how it becomes like a bit of a game, right? Where you're trying to battle misinformation. So I think something like that, could be really interesting down the line.
Cool.
Thank you for that
so
question.
much for your talk.
Yeah, thank you.
Emma, I'm going to take a question from the chat because I think it's related to this. And Alana asked, can you talk more about how the micro and macro approaches to storytelling add meaning?
Yes, great question. So I think that's a really important note, is that all of the rings provide meaning to audiences, but I think they manifest in different ways. So the micro ring adds meaning through specificity and through examples and through kind of concrete relevance to an audience. So a micro ring story about climate change might be someone discovering bird migration patterns in their backyard are different, perhaps, right? So it's a specific person thinking about what's happening in their own backyard on a local scope, but it's actually implicating, right, the larger climate change story. But a macro story can still, of course, have meaning. It might be about, global migration patterns of birds. It might be an organization who's studying those patterns, right? So you're taking kind of a similar topic, but you're talking about it in various levels of specificity. So I think any of those rings will provide meaning to an audience, but they're going to resonate in different ways.
Okay. We have a question from Paul. Please, if you unmute yourself, please. Thank you.
Thank you for the presentation, Emma.
Thank
Fantastic
you.
stuff. I'm curious about the decision when to use stories versus not. And not to put you on the spot, but your presentation did not use a story, right? And I'm guessing it's because it needed to be so concise, get it out there. They already are here for a reason. It's self-selected. I don't need a story to bring them in and relate. But that's me projecting. I wonder, can you say anything about that decision about when it's worth the sort of cost in time and so forth of weaving a narrative into a presentation?
Yes, thank you so much for that question. It's something I talk about at length in the 5th chapter of the book, which I call Constellation Practices, about the time and the resources needed to really be trained or to experiment with stories and then to actually deliver them. And that's oftentimes time and resources we don't necessarily give or support or incentivize, right, for scientists or for academics. So I think that's a really important point. To the idea that I didn't tell a story, I might just rephrase it to say, were there more elements of narratives I could have more directly or overtly called upon, right? I gave a very plain, less narrative-like story than I could have of my journey to thinking about this book and to this topic. It's interesting because each of the chapters does start with a more like formal story or vignette that then talks about the larger points in the story. Of the chapter rather. But you're right, I trimmed out a lot of the narrative features that I could have included in that presentation for many of the reasons that you noted. It may not be appropriate to always have a micro ring or explicit narrative features in a technical sphere conversation or in an academic audience where folks aren't necessarily going to need those same compelling resonating features as other audiences. So I absolutely agree with you that the use of this web is going to be audience, context, purpose dependent. I would never say always go for the micro ring, right? I would always say, I would say instead think about your audience and your purpose in the situation, and when is it appropriate to add more explicit, overt narrative features, and when is it not necessary? Yeah, or could even be counterproductive for sure. If I had spent 10 minutes, talking about my day or the journey to the book, I never would have gotten to the actual content, right? Great question.
Great. Emma, I'm going to take now a question from the chat, and it's Thais, and it's, how can stories help communicate the uncertainties inherent to any scientific results without discrediting them to the public?
Oh, that's a really great question. In the sequence and scope chapter of the book, I specifically talk about uncertainty. And part of uncertainty for me is that sequence relationship between what we know now and what could potentially happen, right, in the future. And I think the uncertainty is inherent to the scientific process, and we certainly don't want to forget that or undermine that or pretend that uncertainty is not there. But what we can do is think about rephrasing it and say, hey, based on what we know now, this is not only likely but probable. Thinking about the ways we change up the language that we're using in providing specific amounts of information. So instead of, I'm trying to think about, I live in Las Vegas. I'm thinking about gambling probabilities. People are not very good at understanding how likely things are or not. So thinking about other ways that you might communicate the likelihood of something happening to make it more concrete, or conversely, talking about the uncertainty in inaction, right? If we don't do something, these are all the negative things, right, that are likely to happen as well. So I think this is a really important question in terms of communicating that uncertainty. But I do think it's important to be direct that, hey, uncertainty is part of the process. We're dealing with things that are happening in the future. But based on what we know now and what we've done in the past, this is what we're pretty sure the future is going to look like, or at least give options, right, for what that future might look like, which the IPCC does, I think, very well. It's difficult, unfortunately.
Thank you. Jennifer, would you like to unmute yourself, please?
Yeah, thanks so much, Valentina, and hi, Emma.
Hi, Jennifer.
Hi. So this was great, and I spend a lot of time thinking about stories, and it's kind of, my question for you is kind of a follow-up to Paul's question, and like when Paul said, Emma, that you shared what you did, but you didn't tell a story. I immediately thought, but of course you shared a story like that. So I get what I'm like. I'm really interested in thinking about stories in really broad ways. Like this is all stories, like that. Like I think about like Thomas King has The Truth About Stories and Native Narrative, and it's like he just says the truth about stories is that's all there is, and
Right.
I find that like super powerful and really important. But my question is, like, do you think that really broad way of thinking about stories, do you find that helpful?
Yes, I do. And that was sort of my rephrasing, right, of Paul's questions was I was telling a story, but it didn't have a lot of maybe overt narrative features we might associate with story. I draw in the book a lot from, Sean Wilson's work about methodology and ceremony and thinking about, I know it's a derogatory term, but the term me search. When we research something, that's inherently a story. It's something important to us. It's in a journey, right, of our academic or methodological careers. So I do think about this work certainly as rooted in story, and I take that broad view of story as Fisher does, because I think it is useful to think about the ways that we communicate as inherently related to narrative elements. If we think about Homo narrans and the storytelling animal, if we're always bringing in stories or making sense of things through stories, I think it's a helpful view. But I think it's also important to acknowledge that some things are going to instinctively look like a story, right, or sound like a story, or appear to be a story, and some things are not. And that tells us something else as well about the importance of narrative and how some institutions and disciplines are trying to run away from narrative, even as they are still telling a story. That's a particular kind of story about how they don't think story elements, right, are useful to that discipline.
Right. Okay. Thank you. Well, sometime we'll chat. I think you're more conflating narrative and story, I guess, than I would necessarily.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
But anyway, super interesting, and I look forward to hearing what other folks will ask you about. Thanks, Emma.
Thanks, Jennifer.
Emma, I would like to take a little bit of this question from Alana too, but no, sorry, it was because so many chats are coming, so many questions. Herb Siemens, and it's if you could talk more about how can storytelling will inspire action, or what is the objective of doing stories in science, and specifically her approaches. I'm not clear what are the objectives or outcomes that are being aimed by the variety of approaches you are presenting. Is it to change personal behavior, mobilize support, inspire action? What are your thoughts on what the objectives should be for storytelling in science?
I don't think there should be one objective. I think having a variety of different stories is good. The more stories that we can tell, the more variety we can add will resonate with more people in different ways. I would say whatever the objective is of the particular storyteller, they'll want to then tailor their strategies to meet that objective. Perhaps the objective is just to share information, as we were talking about with Paul in my presentation. If it's just to share information, then maybe you'll be thinking about the different narrative features in different ways. If the objective is to inspire action, I would definitely want someone to pay attention to the character and action wedges of the story, to think about how we can invite audiences to be characters in the narrative and give concrete as opposed to more abstract actions that they can take. I'm thinking about the end of a documentary, right, which is a story or a lot of stories about a different topic, and then there's typically some kind of call to action at the end, right? So I think depending on the objective, you might pay attention to some of the different wedges, but I don't think there's an objective we should necessarily follow or that we always have to follow. I think a variety of stories about climate change will just help to get more people aware, get more people involved, and will give the storyteller agency over the kind of story they want to tell.
And in this sense, can you provide an example, a concrete example of a successful science communication project or initiative that used storytelling to convey the importance of either environmental issue or data of climate change or something? Can you provide us, please?
Yes, for sure. In the constellation practices chapter I mentioned before, I go through exemplar stories or exemplar strategies that folks might experiment with. One of the narratives I really like that I talked about is it was a video created by Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez called "A Message from the Future." And it's a drawing, it's like a watercolor, animated watercolor drawing of her in the future talking about how we had passed the Green New Deal and all the amazing things that had unfolded because of it. So I think it's a really interesting story because it messes with our sense of sequence. It uses that more abstract macro level sequence to bring things out of order and do a flashback. Instead of following things more from cause and effect from now into the future. But that manipulation, right, of time also gives us a character to follow. It gives us concrete actions that occurred. It makes us more certain about the outcomes of different actions. So I really love that flashback style of narrative that the Congresswoman tells, and the ways that it's communicating and translating a technical policy document so public audiences can know what's in the bill.
Thank you. We have a question here from the chat. What are your thoughts around anthropomorphizing, sorry for my English, nature
No problem.
In your research? Have you found that helps people resonate, empathize with the content, or does it detract from it? Is it what we should be doing more of?
Yeah, so anthropomorphizing animals, I map on the meso ring of the character wedge. I think it cuts both ways, like most tools. Some people find identifying with animals, anthropomorphizing them, giving them agency and helping them make decisions as a really powerful way to connect with characters in the story. For example, in the story of evolution, I talk about how humans don't appear until the very end. That's sort of the point of the story. So to insert humans into the story before then is just simply not scientifically accurate. But there are ways potentially to play with the characterization and the agency that we give animals, right, or even nature within the story can create some of that identification with characters that doesn't necessitate having a human there. There are some disagreements, of course, about how accurate that is, because we don't necessarily think about animals purposefully driving evolution as opposed to just naturally fitting in with their environment. But I cite a study by El Shafi in the piece that talks about how anthropomorphizing animals, specifically in the study in the communication of evolution, can be a really effective way to teach the concept, especially to children. So I think it's something worth experimenting with. And of course, this idea that we anthropomorphize animals unnecessarily is really a Western construction. A lot of cultures do think about animals, right, as similar to people, or nature as similar to people in their characterization. So I think that also allows us to experiment kind of with other storytelling conventions as well. So I would say I'm generally in support of it, but it might not necessarily resonate with all audiences.
Eva, and we have been talking a lot of how to do this, but one of the questions that comes to my mind is being a science communicator. It's we come from different backgrounds. Some of us are scientists, some of already come from a writing background. But in your opinion, and especially because the term competition has been repeated several times, it's like science, it's competing. So how do we prepare for this competition as science communicators? What skills would we need to look for, like to better write stories and to understand the web that you're proposing? What would be your advice on people that are starting and want to reinforce skills, and what would you say?
Absolutely. It's a great question. I think I'd first say that I'm hopeful that lots of people might see themselves as science communicators beyond folks who do it, directly as a part of their job or because they are scientists. I think we can all be science communicators in our daily conversations and in our social media posts, things like that. So I do encourage, a broader sense of who science communicators are and who they can be. I think diversifying where science's stories come from can be really useful. But of course, there comes that problem of training, right? Are we giving people specific training in communication strategies? Are we giving people the time and the resources, as I mentioned before, to hone those skills? Are we rewarding or incentivizing those skills? For folks, I'm I'm hoping there's a mix of practitioners and academics in the room, but depending on our job responsibilities and and our workload contracts, it's seen as potentially detrimental, right, to advancing in your career if you're doing things that are public facing, if there's not directly a merit for it in your workload. So how can we reshape the ways that we're designing positions or jobs, creating more space for folks to develop, this time and energy. In the spirit of telling stories, I'll tell a brief story of a very, very, very early iteration of this book project I presented to the College of Sciences at UNLV. And once the talk was advertised, I got a message from one of the organizers that said, hey, a few students in the college are interested in maybe pursuing a science comm career. Would you be interested in meeting with a few students, ahead of time? And I said, oh, yes, absolutely. There were over 50 students in that room. And it just completely blew my mind that this was something that folks were really thinking of and were considering as students. So can we incorporate communication training more directly into sciences, at the college level, in other areas of education, make these resources available? I think there's definitely interest in it if we can make it more accessible to folks.
Thank you. We have one more question here from the chat. How can science communicators better incorporate uncertainty into the stories they tell without making it impossible for publics to decide how to respond?
Yeah, that's a really great question. We were talking a bit about uncertainty in terms of, the sequence wedge and how uncertainty is about the relationship between the present and the future. But I thank Joshua for this question because he's also bringing in the idea of action, right? How do we encourage characters in the story to take concrete actions when we are uncertain? And I think part of that answer, and it's of course going to depend on the story and depend on the context and things, but I think part of the answer to this is to think about what's going to happen with inaction, right? If we don't act or we fail to act, there are things that are almost certainly going to happen. So avoiding uncertainty means that these other horrendous things might take place. And then I also think providing concrete actions that are accessible to individuals can be helpful. And by accessible in that sense, I mean, what are things that people generally are capable of doing? You have the resources to be able to do that aren't incredibly daunting. If you just tell people, okay, we've got to fix the environment, it can seem really abstract and really daunting. But instead thinking about more micro level actions or concrete actions that folks can take might help mitigate those feelings of uncertainty. Certainly the research suggests that by encouraging people to get involved, volunteer, and take action, we can mitigate, for example, feelings of climate anxiety that might encourage people to see the problem as too large to address. So I think, yeah, incorporating some specific actions and acknowledging that, yes, uncertainty happens, but we also are the level of uncertainty we have is fairly low. We're very certain about a lot of things.
We have another question. Have you seen any effective participatory storytelling techniques? How can we get more audience participation going?
Absolutely. In that constellation practices chapter in the book, I talk about a lot of exemplar stories. I briefly mentioned that message from Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez from the future. I also really found an interest. I don't know if this was circulated widely, but the Centers for Disease Control created a comic book about children battling, vaccine preventable illnesses. So thinking about incorporating different forms of storytelling or different genres, I think in terms of creative ways can be really interesting. In terms of participatory storytelling, I talk about in that chapter citizen science projects. So how people can get actively involved in the conducting of scientific research or contribute to the study of science. I think those are ways that audiences can see themselves as part of the narrative, and then developing scientific outcomes, have more buy-in, right, in the story science is telling. So I think anything that gets folks involved in science through education, through citizen science projects, volunteering, I think those are all really important ways to diversify science's stories.
Emma, one question that came to my mind now is that if we're science communicators, we are narrating the different stories, presenting the different angles, but should we just stay as narrators, or can we also present our own stories? Is it objective? Mm-hmm. Is it valid? What do you think?
Oh, absolutely. If you are a science storyteller, you could consider putting yourself in the story as a character, right? So then you would be operating on the character and the storyteller wedge. It might also be the case that you want someone else to tell your story, or you want to bring in diverse storytellers, or you want to, or you don't feel comfortable positioning yourself as a character. I think any of those relationships work, but storytellers can certainly see themselves as part of the story, talk about their own experiences, and then they're serving as characters themselves in the narrative. That can help to make the story relatable to folks, because you immediately, if you're hearing the story, you probably know the storyteller, so you might care about them, right, as a character. I think that works particularly well in interpersonal conversations, thinking about the relationships that you have with folks to help them care about the topic, give them concrete examples. Yeah, absolutely. I also noticed, I think there was a question that got skipped a bit earlier from Brianne, and I think it's a really great question. Do you mind if I answer that, Valentina?
No, please go ahead. Maybe I missed it.
That's okay. I think
Sorry.
a bunch of questions came in all at the same time, but
Yeah.
Brianne asked about the risks of including micro-level narratives and characters in certain stories, for example, such as the climate story. And I think that's incredibly important. And that's one of the reasons why the book is not saying, hey, do micro ring all the time, right, for all the wedges. If we center individual characters, as Brianne said, and we think about emphasizing them, like I'm thinking about Michael Mann has been pointed out a lot from climate skeptics through like the hockey stick controversy. Individual scientists get called out in things like Phil Jones and ClimateGate. That can absolutely be detrimental to the story of climate change by just focusing on individuals and potentially their flaws, which then get abstracted out to the whole of science. One way to incorporate individual characters to try to avoid that is to think about, what about individuals who have been impacted by climate change? So, folks in certain countries or in communities who are experiencing the disasters, right? The increase of climate-driven natural disasters. Those can be individuals that we draw into our stories, not necessarily scientists or not necessarily in this case, individual characters with political views. So thinking about being creative and bringing alternative characters into the narratives. If you do want to use a micro ring for character, or you might think of a different ring a different wedge to map on the micro ring to bring that concreteness into the story without falling into this trap here. I talk about in the book in more detail about the tenet of disinterestedness in science and how we oftentimes think about scientists as corrupted through their political or financial motivation. So yeah, that's a risk I talk about directly in the book. I think it's so important to keep in mind.
Okay, Emma. So we're about to we have a few minutes more, and we will end the session. But Emma, where can people order the book? I just put a link that it's on the UC Press website. But is there another way to get hold of your book?
Yeah, so the UC Press website's in the chat. It's also through this QR code I have on this final slide here. Please do use the discount code EVENT40. Encourage your library to buy it. That would be really great. I believe it's also on a bunch of other different booksellers. If you don't want to go through UC Press's website and you prefer to use a different bookseller, if you do, please consider leaving a review. I do really appreciate your support, and I'm also happy to get any feedback from folks. If you do start using the narrative webs, I haven't done any empirical testing on it as a tool, but that's something that I'm certainly interested in, and how people begin to use it, how flexible and dynamic they think it is. Maybe we need to tweak it. I say in the book, potentially other cultures might develop, or other forms of storytelling might want to change some of the wedges or change some of the interpretations. So I'm totally open to that, this tool being dynamic and being adjusted by its users.
So I thank you so much, Emma. I think we have a lot of questions, and but it's also an invitation to read the book, and I want to know more of the details that you talked about. So I will get also, definitely, I will get a copy of that. And I would like to end the session with something that Thais shared with us, because I think this is the spirit we have to live this session. And she says, there's a Brazilian indigenous philosopher and writer called Alton Krenak, who said that telling one more story is the best way to postpone the end of the world. So we have a mission. let's go tell our stories the best we
I love
can.
that.
And
Yeah.
yeah, so, and with the help that you are giving us in that book, I think we're gonna be we have good storytellers. So thank you, everyone. Please follow us, the organization, on social media. If you would like to become a member, we would be honored. And Emma, thank you. Any final thoughts before we say goodbye?
I'm just so flattered and honored to see you all, new faces, old faces of friends on my screen. I'm just truly touched, and I thank you all so much.